clerk didn't raise her voice, but the words still hit like a slap. "You can't leave." She said it as if the building itself had decided it. I stood at the federal counter with $12 pressed flat in my sweaty palm and an eviction notice folded into a sharp rectangle that dug into my fingers. I wasn't there for trouble. I wasn't there for drama. I was there for one stamp, one approval, one clean exit from a life that had been choking me for years. The job was basic, humiliating even, but it was steady. A janitor contract across the border. Enough to stop the next lock change, the next landlord pounding on the door, the next night sleeping with my shoes on just in case I had to run. I leaned forward to hear her, and that's when the screen between us lit up red, pulsing hard like an angry warning. A silent strobe began to spin on the wall. The air shifted. 2 armed guards stepped out from nowhere, not rushing, not shouting, just moving with the calm precision of people who already know how this ends. The clerk swallowed, eyes wide and shiny, and looked at me like she was seeing a ghost. Her hands hovered over the keyboard as if it might bite. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice cracked on the word, "this social security number belongs to a child who died in 1991. For a second, my brain refused to cooperate. Died. Child. 1991. Those words didn't connect to me because I was standing right there, breathing, heart hammering, nails bitten raw from stress, and I had used that number my entire life. School forms, job applications, doctor visits I couldn't afford. It had always been mine. I opened my mouth to tell her she was wrong, that the system was wrong, that everyone makes mistakes, but the guards moved closer and the clerk's eyes flicked to something behind me. I turned, and the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that sounded almost polite, as if the building was pretending nothing serious was happening. A man stepped out like he'd been waiting for his cue. Dark suit, sharp lines, no wasted movement. He walked through the tension without asking permission, and the guards didn't stop him. They didn't even challenge him. They shifted, like he outranked the whole room without saying a word. He didn't look at the flashing light or the clerk or the crowd forming behind the metal detectors. He looked straight at me, and my stomach dropped because the expression on his face wasn't confusion. It wasn't suspicion. It was something colder and more personal, like seeing a missing piece of your life walk into the room. He stopped a couple feet away and studied me like he was confirming a theory. Then he said it, calm and certain, like he'd practiced it 1,000 times. "Welcome back, Noah." The name landed wrong and right at the same time. Wrong because it wasn't mine. Right because it felt like a lock turning in my chest. And I understood, without anyone explaining it yet, that I wasn't about to have a normal day ever again. I didn't get dragged to a cell, didn't get thrown into a chair under buzzing lights with a camera pointed at my face. Instead, the man introduced himself as Mr. Sterling and guided me away from the counter with a hand hovering near my elbow, not touching but ready to steady me if I fell. He led me through a secure hallway, past doors that clicked open before we reached them, into an office that felt insulated from the building's noise. The room smelled like expensive coffee and leather, like money had been sitting there for decades. Sterling closed the door and the sound outside vanished, which somehow made everything worse. Silence left space for panic. He poured ice water into a glass and placed it on a polished desk with slow care, like he was trying not to spook a wild animal. "Drink," he said. "You're in shock." I tried to lift the glass, but my hands trembled so hard the ice rattled like teeth. My throat felt tight, like it was shrinking. I kept thinking the guards would burst in, that someone would accuse me of fraud, that this was a trap. Sterling didn't look like a man setting a trap. He looked like a man who finally caught up to something that had been running for years. I was 32 and exhausted in the deep way you don't fix with sleep. I'd spent my adult life scrubbing other people's messes, wiping tables, mopping floors, taking shifts nobody wanted, getting paid late, getting yelled at for asking for what I was owed. I'd moved apartments like a fugitive because rent was always a week behind and sympathy runs out fast. I'd learned how to be small, how to apologize before anyone demanded it, how to accept disrespect because arguing costs energy and energy costs food and food costs money. I'd been raised in a house where I was never called by my name without it sounding like an insult. Mara was what he called me, and he said it like a stain. The sheriff in my town, Richard, always reminded me I wasn't his real child. His real daughter got the soft bed and the warm dinner and the laughter. I got a cot near the laundry room and rules that changed depending on his mood. I believed I was unwanted because that belief was safer than wondering why. Sterling slid a folder across the desk and didn't open it right away. He let it sit there like an accusation. "We've been looking for you for 3 decades, he said, and the way he spoke made it sound less like a dramatic line and more like a fact that had cost people sleep. He flipped the folder open and my eyes locked onto a photo that wasn't really a photo. It was a digital rendering, an age-progressed image, the kind you see on missing person posters. A young woman stared back at me and she had my eyes, my jawline, my nose. But she looked different in the way that hurt. Her skin looked rested. Her posture looked confident. Her expression looked safe, loved. I felt something twist in my chest because the image wasn't showing me who I was. It was showing me who I could have been. Sterling tapped the page lightly. "This is what you might have looked like if you hadn't been taken," he said, and the word taken made the air turn cold. He said my real name was Noah Hayes, born into a wealthy family in Texas, and my parents had spent decades tearing their world apart trying to find me. He said I was kidnapped from a park in 1991. The details came in sharp fragments like broken glass. A toddler, a public place, a moment of distraction, then gone. My brain tried to reject it because if it was true, everything in my life had to be relabeled. Every memory would change meaning. Every insult would turn into evidence. Every quiet shame would become something that was done to me, not something I deserved. The room tilted. I gripped the arms of the leather chair like I was on a boat in rough water. Fear should have been the first emotion. Instead, what came was a strange relief, like my body recognized the truth before my mind could handle it. The feeling was awful and comforting at the same time, because it explained too much. Suddenly, Richard's cruelty stopped being random. It stopped being he's a harsh man, or I was a difficult kid, or maybe I deserved it. It became deliberate, calculated. He made me sleep in the laundry room while his biological daughter lived like a princess because he needed me to feel grateful for scraps. He criticized me in public and smirked when people laughed because humiliation makes you quiet. He called me expensive, called me a burden, reminded me daily that I owed him my life. I used to think he hated me because I was unlovable. Sitting in that office, staring at that age-progressed face, I understood a darker truth. Richard didn't hate me because I was a bad kid. He hated me because I was proof. I was the living, breathing reminder of something criminal. If I ever got curious, if I ever got confident, if I ever looked too closely at paperwork or old stories, his whole world could collapse. Tears came fast, hot, humiliating. Sterling didn't interrupt. He didn't tell me to calm down or stop being dramatic. He watched with the careful patience of someone who understands what this does to a person. I wasn't crying because I was weak. I was crying because the story I'd built to survive was breaking apart. I wasn't crying because I was afraid of being wrong. I was crying because I wasn't wrong. The shame I carried, the feeling that I was broken at the core, started to crack like thin ice. If I had been stolen, then maybe I hadn't failed my whole life. Maybe my life had been stolen first. That thought was so powerful it felt dangerous. Sterling pushed a sleek phone across the desk. "Your parents are on a private jet," he said. "They're landing in about 20 minutes. You're safe here. Federal territory. Nobody can touch you." I stared at that phone like it was a door to another universe. For the first time, the ground beneath me felt solid. I wasn't the girl with $12 and an eviction notice anymore. I wasn't the unwanted stepchild. I was Mara the mistake. I was Noah Hayes, and I was about to meet the people who had been searching for me like I mattered. My finger hovered over the screen. I could almost hear a woman's voice on the other end, crying my real name, telling me she never stopped. I let myself breathe. I let my shoulders drop. I let the idea of safety settle into my bones. That was the moment everything snapped, because life doesn't hand you peace without collecting a price. The door didn't swing open politely. It slammed inward like it was kicked, the sound sharp enough to slice through the quiet. I flinched so hard I nearly dropped the phone. 2 deputies rushed in, hands near their weapons, boots pounding on the polished floor. They moved like they'd been told to act fast and ask questions later. Behind them came Richard, and the sight of him hit me with a physical jolt. He wasn't in his usual stained flannel, the version of himself that played the small-town man routine. He wore his dress uniform, badge gleaming, hat tucked under his arm, the picture of authority. He didn't look at Sterling. He didn't look at the security features of the room. He looked straight at me and his eyes weren't angry. They were empty, like a door that had been shut for years. "Step away from the suspect," he barked. Sterling stood up slowly, putting his body between me and the deputies. "This is federal," Sterling said, calm but hard. "You have no jurisdiction." Richard didn't blink. He slapped a folded paper onto the desk like a threat. He said he had a warrant signed 10 minutes ago, felony charges, grand larceny. He pointed at me, the same finger that used to jab my chest when I was a kid. "She stole $50,000 worth of diamond jewelry from my wife's bedroom," he said, loud enough for the deputies to hear and for my stomach to drop. "She fled this morning. I'm taking her into custody." My mouth opened and a sound came out that was half laugh, half scream. "That's a lie," I shouted. "I haven't been to your house in years." Richard's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. "Save it for the judge," he said. Then, like he was ordering a coffee, he told them to cuff me. A deputy grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back with enough force to send pain up my shoulder like fire. My vision blurred. Sterling moved, but Richard stepped in close, chest to chest, speaking in a low voice that carried a warning. He knew exactly how far Sterling could go without it turning into chaos. The cuffs clicked shut, and that sound felt final, like a door slamming on my future. I looked at Sterling, desperate because he had promised me safety. Sterling's jaw tightened. He was furious, but he was trapped by procedure. Richard knew how to use paperwork like a weapon. He leaned toward my ear, close enough that I could smell his aftershave and the faint sour of sweat under it. "I told you not to dig," he whispered, and his voice was calm in a way that made my blood run cold. "You should have stayed quiet." He didn't need to explain what he meant. I understood the threat under the words. He wasn't taking me to jail to process me. He was taking me to end this before my real parents could even get close. The deputies dragged me into the hallway, and the fluorescent lights overhead stretched into a dizzy tunnel. My boots skidded on the polished floor. Richard's grip on my arm was a vice, and the familiarity of it hit like a flashback. The hallway dissolved into rain and memory. I was 18 again, standing on the porch of the only home I'd known, holding a garbage bag filled with clothes. Water ran down my face and mixed with tears I pretended not to have. Through the window, I could see Richard and his daughter eating dinner under warm light, laughing as if the world was kind. I remembered how I'd begged just to stay one more night. I remembered how he'd opened the door and looked down at me not as a person, but as a problem he'd finally solved. "You should be thanking me," he'd said back then, voice dripping with self-righteous poison. "I kept a roof over your head. I fed you. I clothed you. You weren't even my blood. Do you know how expensive it is to keep a mistake?" I remembered how I believed him. I remembered falling to my knees on wet concrete and thanking him for scraps like it was mercy. That memory used to make me feel sick with shame. Now it made me feel something else. The truth slammed into me harder than the cuffs. It hadn't been charity. It had been control. It hadn't been kindness. It had been camouflage. Richard hadn't raised me as a stepdaughter. He'd kept me as a secret, a witness, a piece of evidence that could ruin him if I ever grew brave enough to look back. He trained me to be grateful for my own prison. Every insult was a lesson. Every humiliation was a leash. Every time he told me I was lucky he didn't throw me out. He was really telling me to never question why I was there in the first place. He needed me desperate so I wouldn't ask about documents. He needed me small so I wouldn't push back. And in the hallway, with his hand crushing my arm, something inside me stopped being afraid. The fear didn't fade. It burned away, replaced by sharp clarity and rage so clean it felt like oxygen. I stopped fighting the way they expected. I dropped my weight completely, going limp like a dead anchor. The deputies stumbled, their grip slipping for half a second, and in that half second I felt control return to me for the first time in my life. We halted just short of the elevators. Richard snarled for me to get up, to stop making a scene, and his voice had that old familiar command, the one that used to fold me in half. But it didn't work anymore. I planted my feet, straightened slowly, and turned my head until I was looking directly at him. For years I couldn't meet his eyes without flinching. Now I held his stare like a weapon. I wanted him to see that the scared girl he trained was gone. He had spent decades shaping me into quiet obedience, and he had accidentally built something else instead. I didn't speak softly. I didn't beg. I screamed, and my scream wasn't a plea. It was an instruction. "Check the timestamp," I shouted, loud enough that the sound slapped the marble walls and bounced back. The deputies hesitated because certainty is fragile when someone yells a detail that can be verified. Sterling came running, hand going to the radio on his shoulder. Richard kicked at my leg, trying to shut me up, and the motion was so desperate it exposed him. Sterling didn't slow down. He shoved his body into the elevator doors as they tried to close, forcing them open with a metallic screech. Federal security officers appeared like they'd been summoned by the noise, hands ready, blocking the path. Sterling's voice changed. The calm office tone vanished. This was command. "Nobody moves," he said. "Give me the warrant." Richard puffed up, shouting about lawful arrest, about authority, but Sterling held out his hand and didn't blink. Richard hesitated for just a beat, and that hesitation was the first crack. Sterling scanned the paper once, then looked up at the clock above the security desk. He looked at the security monitors, then back at Richard with a quiet expression that was more frightening than shouting. "You're sloppy," Sterling said, and his voice was so controlled it sounded like ice. He turned the warrant so the deputies could see it. "Signed at 8 o'clock. Then he pointed at the monitor. "Our cameras show her coming through the metal detectors at 7:45. She's been in this building the entire time." The hallway went silent in that instant, the kind of silence where everyone suddenly hears their own breathing and realizes they might have been part of a crime. The deputies looked at each other. Their hands loosened on my arms. Richard started shouting about mistakes, about clerical errors, about how it happened earlier, later, whenever. But the paper said what it said. A lie with a timestamp is still a lie. Sterling stepped closer to Richard, and the space between them tightened like a rope being pulled. "If you lied on an affidavit to get this signed, that's perjury," Sterling said. "If you tried to drag a federal witness out of here with falsified charges, that's kidnapping." The word kidnapping hung in the air like a heavy object. It changed the temperature. The deputies released me like my skin was hot. I stumbled back, rubbing my wrists, putting distance between myself and Richard. He stood alone in the center of the hallway, and for the first time his authority looked thin. He looked at his deputies backing away, looked at the federal officers, looked at Sterling, then looked at me, and I saw it in his face. He understood he couldn't bully his way through this room. His badge didn't mean anything here, and when bullies lose the room, they either collapse or explode. He reached for his taser, not his gun, because even he understood the line he couldn't cross. The yellow plastic looked obscene in his hand, like a child's toy used for something evil. He pointed it towards Sterling and shouted for everyone to back off, his voice cracking with panic. Federal weapons came up instantly, trained on him, and in that moment the lobby felt like a held breath. Sterling didn't flinch. "Drop it," he said. Richard's eyes darted, calculating, searching for an exit that wasn't there. For a second I thought he might pull the trigger out of spite, not because it would help him, but because he couldn't stand losing. Then the bravado drained from him. He wasn't a martyr. He was a coward with a badge. He dropped the taser and raised his hands, sneering like he'd chosen restraint rather than been cornered. And then he tried to flip the script with a smile. He said the quiet part out loud like it would save him, like a confession could become a shield. He admitted he knew about the kidnapping. He said he helped cover it up. He said he kept me, hid me, stole my life, and he spoke with a strange pride, as if he expected the room to be impressed by how long he'd gotten away with it. Sterling moved in, ready with cuffs, but Richard laughed and told him to check the calendar. He claimed too much time had passed, that certain charges couldn't touch him anymore. He tried to make the law into a wall between him and consequences. The room chilled again, not because everyone believed him, but because everyone knew there are loopholes, and loopholes are where monsters survive. Sterling didn't argue the way Richard wanted. He didn't shout. He didn't look helpless. He lifted a thick file and set it on the desk with a heavy pen that sounded like a bullet. "You're thinking like a criminal who only knows one statute," Sterling said. "But fraud doesn't turn into ownership just because you waited long enough." He explained that property obtained through deception can be reclaimed, that money funneled and hidden can be traced, that control built on lies can be dismantled. He spoke in plain, deadly certainty. The ransom payments, the stipends, the investments, the taxes, the accounts. They followed the trail. Richard snapped that it was his money, his assets, his life. The words came out like a tantrum, and something inside me rose up, calm and sharp. I stepped forward and met his eyes. "You didn't earn it," I said. "You managed it while pretending it belonged to you." That was the moment Richard's fear became real, because it wasn't prison he feared most. It was losing everything. His house, his power, his reputation, the image he used to crush people. Sterling cut him off before he could spin another story. He pointed out the crimes that still counted, the ones with clocks still running, the lies on paper, the money that moved in shadows. The guards moved in then. And Richard's voice turned into a high, furious sound as cuffs snapped around his wrists. He tried to shout his way out, tried to threaten lawsuits, tried to remind everyone who he was, but the room no longer belonged to him. For the first time, he was just a man in uniform with nothing left to hide behind. I watched him struggle, and I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel pity. I felt something like quiet justice settling into place. Sterling slid a document toward me, an authorization, a set of signatures that turned the abstract idea of your life was stolen into real-world action. My hand hovered for a second because I'd spent my whole life being told I didn't deserve anything. Then I remembered the age-progressed face in the folder, the version of me that looked safe and loved, and I realized I could either keep living like I owed the world an apology, or I could take back what was mine without shame. I signed. My name looked strange on paper, like a new language, but it also looked right. The lobby seemed brighter as the tension broke, sunlight spilling through glass and turning the polished floor into a mirror. People moved again. Breathing returned. Richard was hauled away still barking, still snarling, still convinced he could bully reality into changing. But his voice faded down the corridor, and the silence he left behind felt clean. Then I saw them. Two figures rushing in, faces pale and desperate, scanning the room like they were afraid the world would steal me again if they blinked. I didn't need proof or paperwork to know. I felt it in my bones, like something ancient waking up. The woman's mouth formed my real name before her voice could catch up, and when she finally said it, it wasn't just a word. It was a promise she'd been keeping for decades. "Noah," she whispered, and the sound broke something inside me that had been locked tight since childhood. The man beside her reached out, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering like he was afraid to scare me away. They held me like they'd never let go, like their arms were building a barrier against the past. My body shook, not from fear this time, but from the impact of being wanted, being found, being real. For years, I survived by staying numb. I learned to swallow anger, to laugh at cruelty, to accept scraps and call them gifts. That habit didn't vanish in a minute. Even in my parents' arms, part of me waited for the catch, waited for someone to pull away and say I didn't deserve this after all. But nobody pulled away. Nobody questioned my worth. Sterling stood nearby, watching the hallway like a guard dog, while federal officers handled the mess Richard created. The world didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became honest. That honesty was terrifying and thrilling at once. My old name, my old life, my old story, they all fell behind me like a shed skin. I looked toward the glass doors, toward the bright afternoon outside, and I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't begging for scraps. I wasn't surviving someone else's version of me. For the first time in my life, I was stepping into my own.